Okay, today we're here to talk about weapons in the library and policies. There's been some recent movement in the law on this, so I've had a couple questions, so this seemed like a useful thing to kind of bring back. Um, of course, I'm still Claire, Claire Membiela. I'm the library law consultant for the Library of Michigan. Here's my contact information. If I can ever give you information or help you out, don't hesitate to contact me. I can tell you the most efficient way to get a hold of me is through email. I am constantly checking email. I do check phone as well, but because I work at home 3 days a week, sometimes the way that my computer communicates with the phone system, sometimes I don't always get notifications that I'm getting a call, so it can take a little bit longer. Um, Here is my disclaimer. Since we are going to be talking about law today, I have to tell you that I can provide information to you, but I cannot be your attorney. You should always check policies with your attorney. You should always confer with your attorney when you have questions regarding policies and the types of policies that your library either requires or the types of things you would like to see in a policy, whether or not they're a good idea legally. If you do not have an attorney and your library is looking for one, you can shoot me an email. I can send you a copy of the list that I keep of attorneys throughout the state that do work with libraries, that do practice library law. And there are more and more all the time. Actually, there are some ones that in the past few years have gotten into it and who are, pretty good. So there's more and more options. So first of all, we're just going to talk a little bit about policies. Now, I do talk about policies a lot, but partly that's because for public libraries, as you all know, policies are integral to the way that you operate and are integral to successful operation of the library. Successful for staff, successful for the patrons, successful for the board, and successful for the director. So it's really important to have that balance of adequate policies and policies that are good policies, right? Because just because you have a policy doesn't always mean it's a good policy. So when you're looking at policies, and right now with so many things going on, it's very easy to have a knee-jerk reaction with policies, right? So it's really easy to say, oh, this happened. I think we need to have a policy to address it. And part of what I want to discuss today is just the idea that, maybe take a deep breath before you have that immediate reaction that you need a policy and think about, so is this policy needed, right? And this applies with weapons policies as well. So when you think about weapons policies, or when you think about your policies and you're going through your policies, as we all know, you should regularly with your board and your attorney, but definitely with your board. You look at it and say, it's kind of like weeding your collection, right? Once in a while, you need to go through your policies and say, gee, do we still need these policies? Because cultures change, communities change, law changes, and technology changes and sometimes renders certain policies, not needed. So you think to yourself, what policies do I still need and what policies, can I get rid of? And then what new policies do we need to have? So you always want to look at, do I really need this policy? Is this really going to be useful for me, or am I just addressing this immediate issue that occurred that may or may not happen again in the same way? What is the intent of the policy, right? So if you decide that you do need this policy, you want to think about, well, what do I want this policy to do? Right? Again, it can be, sometimes it's a knee-jerk reaction, right? Because something happened and everybody's freaked out about it. And as, a good library director that you are, you want to address it, right? You don't want your staff to be freaked out. You don't want members of the public to come up and be freaked out. So you want to make sure it gets addressed. So you think, well, okay, what do I intend to do with this policy? So if I want to have a weapons policy, or if I have a weapons policy that I'm evaluating, so what is the real intent of this policy, right? Is the intent to prevent weapons from coming in the library? Is the intent to address the 3D printing question because we're getting a 3D printer or we have a 3D printer? And I've been seeing this more in the news, or I've had people ask me about it. Is it, every year we have a Comic-Con, or we have a Harry Potter or a Star Wars, or a D&D con where people dress up, and we want to make sure that we limit the weapons that people bring, the cosplay weapons, just like many Comic-Cons do. We want to have rules regarding the ability of people to bring these weapons. Or did you have an incident where someone walked in with a semi-automatic, weapon to story hour? So, what is it? What was the kind of spur or the inspiration for this policy? What do you want this policy to do? And then how will this policy be enforced, right? Because you can have the best policy and the best intent, but then you think, well, gee, how am I going to enforce this policy? So if you say, okay, no illegal weapons are allowed in the library, well, how are you going to determine whether a weapon is illegal or not? So if someone brings in a particular firearm, are you that knowledgeable, and is your staff that knowledgeable about firearms that you can tell immediately whether it's an illegal firearm or whether it's a legal firearm? And so, you have to be careful about, what you state, because your staff has to be able to enforce it, right? And enforce it in an objective way, right? It can't be a subjective way where each individual person has to make kind of their own judgment call or decision on whether or not something is, okay. You really want to make that process as kind of you want to make it, so that it's very clear and very, I don't want to say regimented, but it's very, like, you could, look on a list and say, okay, this is okay, this is okay, this is okay, this isn't okay. Even though we know that all enforcement of policies required a certain amount of judgment, it should be, pretty clear as to when there's a violation and when there isn't. You don't want to rely on someone's, use words like appropriate, because you don't want to rely on an individual's internal judgment of what is a quote unquote appropriate and what is not. That should all be laid out for them. So you really want to make sure that you know how your policy is going to be enforced, and that the enforcement is going to be fair and equitable and legal. So kind of to some, when you're looking at policies, you want to make sure they're, clean, as I say. You want to make sure they're clear. The language in the policy is very clear and very simple language, so everybody understands it. Every staff member is going to take the same thing from it. Everybody who's supposed to enforce it is going to take the same thing from it. And every member of the public, all of your patrons who have to abide by it, are going to take the same thing from it, right? So that's a very diverse group. So you want to put it in language that everybody, no matter who they are going to understand and immediately see, oh, this is what I can do and this is what I cannot do. That often means that you're going to want to have some definitions in it, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. You want to make sure it's legal, right? You want to make sure that you're in compliance with the law. For example, you can't have a policy that says you can't bring guns into the library, right? We all want that, but right now, that's not legal, and it's unenforceable, right? Because the court has said in Michigan, you can bring guns into the library. So yeah, there's some shades there, right? Because in Michigan law, even though, you can, carry concealed weapons, or you can have open carry, there are certain requirements and regulations around those things. So, you can follow the law as far as saying, well, you can bring weapons in the library, but for example, a minor can't bring guns into the library. So you have to make sure you understand what the law is surrounding the topic that you are generating the policy about, so that you don't step over that. Because, there's lots of libraries that traditionally have said, well, you can't bring guns in the library. And they just use that as a way to say, well, the members of the public might not know they can bring them in, so we just want to deter them. The problem is, especially nowadays, a lot of people do know, and so it can become a kind of a point of argument, right? And the last thing you want is something that's going to intentionally spur someone to just give you a hard time. You want to make sure they're enforceable, like we talked about a minute ago. You want to make sure that, you know, your great idea is going to be able to be carried through on the ground by your staff, without, or by yourself, without too much of a confrontation with a member of the public, right? You want to make sure that it's not going to be something where you're going to have to argue with something, whether or, you know, over whether or not what they're carrying is a weapon, right? You want to make sure that it's very clear in your policy. This is what we consider weapons. So this is what you're not allowed to have. You know, and that can be, you know, an item designed to harm someone, right? Or an item that could cause, you know, great bodily harm to someone. You know, you can frame it in words where it's a little bit, requires a little bit of judgment, but not, you know, a huge amount of subjectivity on the side of the enforcer. You want to make sure your policies are available. And this is really important. Many libraries have their policies posted to their website, and I applaud that, and I strongly encourage that. Like most of what your library produces, your policies are public record. So keeping them kind of hidden is not going to help you, right? In order for you to be able to fully enforce your policies and fully say, punish, for lack of a better word, patrons that violate those policies. Because when your patron violates a policy and you call them on the carpet for it, you have to provide due process, right? So a prime component of due process is notice. And notice means that the patron is aware that there's a policy on something and what that policy is. So you want to make that as easily attainable as possible to the patron, right? Because if you make it difficult, then they have a very valid excuse to say, hey, I didn't know this, you know, I shouldn't be punished because I didn't know this was a problem. So put your policies on the website, you know, if you can, right? If you can't, make them really available at the desk. You know, put signs in the library saying, you want to see our policies? They're at the desk, or, you know, wherever they are. You can put certain policies, you know, behavior policies, slap them on the wall. You know, if you are very concerned about weapons, or if there's, you know, you're having an issue with some types of weapons, you know, if you have a large contingent of, you know, teenagers or young, which I'm not trying to say that they're the only ones, but, you know, if you have an issue right now with a certain group of patrons who tend to bring weapons into the library, or, you know, there is kind of a real issue, then, you know, post it on your wall, you know, what your policy is concerning this area, so that it's there for all to see. If you have a big noise issue, post your noise policy. If you have a public display of affection issue, post your public display of affection policy. You know, whatever the policy is that you're struggling with, you know, make it as available as possible so that your members of the public see right away, here's what I can't do, and here's what it looks like when I violate it. Make sure all your policies are neutral, right? So your policies have to be applied the same way to all of your patrons, right? You can't discriminate based on age. You know, you can't say, well, you know, this younger kid didn't know, the older kid knew. You have to treat everybody the same. So if you have a noise policy and you have kids that scream and are annoying other patrons, you have to quiet the kids down. You have to tell the kids to be quiet, tell their parents to keep them quiet. You know, if you have a baby crying, you may have to ask the parent to please take the baby to another room, or to take the baby outside until, you know, the baby is calm. You can't just go after, you know, certain patrons who are making noise. You really have to evenly apply your policy. So that's what neutral means. Neutral also means viewpoint neutral. So your policies really can't push an agenda. And that's, you know, so that's also very important, because remember, you know, that also is a First Amendment and an equal protection issue. Okay, enough about just policies. So kind of following along with that, if you're going to have a weapons policy, one of the first things you're going to have to look at in your weapons policy is what's a weapon? So what is the library going to consider a weapon? So I looked through various definitions of weapon, and believe it or not, this was not as easy as you might think it should be. I was pretty surprised at this. So in Michigan, they don't really just define the word weapon, they put it in context of a dangerous weapon. So there's various definitions for dangerous weapon in Michigan law. So among these various ones, some of the ones that I found were in the Michigan School Code, right? A lot of times, schools and libraries are, very often kind of mixed together, right or wrong, it happens a lot. What are dangerous weapons according to the school code? Well, according to the school code, the legislature, listed out weapons. So they said, a dangerous weapon means a firearm, a dagger, a dirk, a stiletto, a knife with a blade over 3 inches, pocket knife, opened by a mechanical device, an iron bar, or brass knuckles. Now, I think the iron bar is kind of interesting. It'd be interesting to me to know the history behind why the legislature included an iron bar. Which, yes, I totally agree. It's a dangerous weapon, but, like, why not a baseball bat? Or why, I just thought it was interesting that they make this list. Now, the legislature, one of the problems in what they call statutory construction, which is what courts use to kind of interpret language in a statute when they're trying to apply it in a real life situation, is they tend to look at lists as, okay, if the legislature went to the trouble of making a list, then this list is what dangerous weapons are for this context. So, again, you have to ask, well, what if a kid brings in a baseball bat? Couldn't a baseball bat be a dangerous weapon? But this list does not include baseball bat, right? So, there are, and we're going to drop down to that in a minute when we get to the criminal code, there are cases that kind of take this kind of a list and kind of extrapolate it out a little bit. But if you're looking at, well, how do I specifically define, you could look at this and say, okay, well, the school code says these are dangerous weapons, and so you have a legal basis to say, okay, look, knives, we consider knives dangerous weapons, and we consider iron bars and brass knuckles, or, similar. So again, you could make an argument for a baseball bat here in your library's own policy. So then you go to the criminal laws. So in the criminal code, the penal code, as we say, there are a couple different definitions, right? So there's definitions that apply to concealed carry and definitions that apply just kind of to open carry. So this first definition is under 750.226 of the penal code, and it says a person shall not with intent to use the same unlawfully against the person of another. So it qualifies it, right? It doesn't say that. It says if you're going to use this, if someone has this with the intent of going to hurt another person, then a firearm, pneumatic gun, dagger, dirk, razor, stiletto, or knife having a blade over 3 inches, or any other dangerous or deadly weapon or instrument. Now, see, that is a little bit broader than the school code, right? Because the school code, according to, usual rules of statutory construction, anything other than something in that list could be argued that it is not a deadly weapon or a dangerous weapon. But in the criminal code, they add on any other dangerous or deadly weapon or instrument. And courts have said that if you have, something that, what is a dangerous or deadly weapon or instrument? Well, when the court kind of analyzes this, they have included other things like, and excluded. Okay, so some of the things they've excluded are things like BB guns, but they have included other things. Then we have the very next statutory section, which is 227, which again says the person shall not carry a dagger, dirk, stiletto, double-edged, non-folding stabbing instrument, which is another description I really enjoy in the statutes. Stabbing instrument. I also enjoy that language because I find it interesting. So double-edged, non-folding. If you think about that, what is it that they're trying to get at here? So they're differentiating a knife versus like a switchblade. Right? So for a long time, switchblades were illegal in Michigan. However, now they are no longer illegal. The section of the statute that made them illegal was actually repealed a few years ago. However, with knives, they do have a blade length restriction. So in Michigan, if a knife is 3 inches or less, it's considered legal to have on your person. It is not considered to be, quote unquote, a dangerous weapon. So I guess, the feeling is that if it's 3 inches or under, it's not long enough to do any serious harm, I guess. But this most recent one we're looking at, 227, 750.227, centers on concealed. So it says, a double-edged non-folding stabbing instrument of any length or any other dangerous weapon except a hunting knife, adapted and carried as such, concealed on or about his or her person, or concealed or otherwise in any vehicle. So you can't have any of these weapons or any other dangerous weapon concealed on your person or in your car unless it's a hunting knife, right? So the supposition is that, if you're going hunting and you have a hunting knife in your car or concealed on your person, that's okay. But so carried as such there means a hunting knife, like you're going hunting. So here we have, again, right here, 3 different definitions of what's a dangerous weapon. And there are many similarities between them, right? A lot of them carry much of the same language, but each of them also differ a little bit. Okay, so then we can even go further. So I mentioned that the courts have looked at this and have modified it to a certain extent. And they say pretty much at the end, and this is a case, again, looking at a BB gun, it says, in light of purpose of the statute, in the context in which the words are used, and prior judicial interpretations of the statute, we conclude that for criminal liability to attach under MCL 750.226, so that's the statute that says if you are carrying a dangerous weapon for purposes of, or intent on going after somebody, going armed with a non-specified weapon or instrument, the potential for physical injury or death must exist with respect to the use of the weapon or instrument. So when they're struggling to define whether or not something would be covered under that statute that talked about any other dangerous weapon, one of the things they look at is, well, can it cause harm? Can it really hurt you? Right? So can it create a serious injury or death? And that's one of the things they look at when they're looking at dangerous weapon. So that kind of takes the statutory language and makes it a little bit more understandable, right? You can kind of now say, oh, okay, now when I read that statute, I kind of can have a better understanding of, okay, how do I fit in this idea of other dangerous, weapons? So if we go back one slide here, and we say here, 226, we say other dangerous or deadly weapon or instrument. If you're trying to struggle to say, well, is this instrument that this person has, would it count as dangerous or deadly? Then, you look at the court and the court says, well, if there's a potential for physical injury or death with respect to the use of it, then yes, we would consider it a dangerous weapon for purposes of that statute. So, that could be if you whack someone over the head with, I love to watch like mysteries. And I saw one last night where, the weapon of choice was actually a meat tenderizer, which is, the thing you pound your steaks with. So that would fall under the statute as a dangerous or deadly weapon, because even though the intent behind that object is not as a weapon, it could seriously injure or harm somebody. So when you're looking at your policies, again, you sit down and you figure out, okay, what do I want this policy to do? And then you can look at definitions like this and say, okay, if this is what the law says, then, okay, I'm going to craft my policy, to kind of, because I need it to be legal, then I'm going to craft it, kind of say, well, if you bring in something to the library that can, cause serious physical injury or death, and you display the intent to use it that way, or you use it that way, then we're taking it away. Or you could say, you could put a list out like the legislature does: stilettos, knives. You could just say not, knives with blades over 3 inches. You could say, or other, items that could be used against somebody or could cause serious physical injury or death. But if you do that, you're going to want to make sure that your staff that enforce it understands this is what we mean by items that could cause physical injury or death, right? So you have kids that come in after school with sports equipment, right? And they have, lacrosse sticks and hockey sticks and baseball bats, which in and of themselves are not weapons. But let's say they start, getting a little rambunctious and they start whacking them against each other, right? Well, at that point, the library could step in and say, you have to, or there's a couple of different ways you could treat this. You could have a policy that says, patrons, there can be no physical altercations, right? Or you could have a policy, if you have a lot of kids that come in, you could have a policy that says, okay, sports equipment, including bats, lacrosse sticks, hockey sticks, have to be kept in their respective, cases, bags, backpacks, and cannot be, brandished or displayed in the library. Cannot be, pulled out while cannot be used while in the library. And then that kind of covers multiple bases, but then you don't have, the prohibition on bringing them into the library, which could get very unwieldy if you have a large after-school contingent who are sports-minded, right? Because when you deal with kids, almost anything could be kind of a weapon, right? So football helmets or baseball. So, but you could restrict them and require them to be kept, out of the way. You're not allowed to take them out. You're not allowed to pull them out. You can keep them where they are. And that's your restriction. But then that wouldn't necessarily be a weapons restriction. So, depending on your individual situation, and again, your purpose for needing a policy, that could be one of the ways in which you deal with it. Okay, more weapons. So yet another definition is in the rules of criminal procedure. Now, the rules of criminal procedure, just in case you don't know, are rules that are applied to attorneys who are practicing in this area of law in the courts, right? So the rules of criminal procedure guide how a process works its way through the court. And so in the rules of criminal procedure, the definition of dangerous weapon, and this definition actually applies specifically to juvenile cases, right? So when attorneys are, representing juveniles and they're either working with each other for a plea agreement or whatever, arguing in court, the rule for, whether something is counted as a dangerous weapon is this list here: loaded or unloaded firearm, whether that firearm works or not, knife, a stabbing instrument, again, which I find interesting, but a stabbing instrument could be a needle, ice pick, so they're kind of covering a lot of bases there. Other objects specifically designed or customarily carried or possessed for use as a weapon. That's kind of another interesting, description. An object that is likely to cause death or bodily injury when used as a weapon and that is used as a weapon or carried or possessed for use as a weapon. That's a kind of a useful definition too. An object or device that is used or fashioned in a manner leading a person to believe the object or device is an object or device that is discussed in 1 through 3. So in other words, something that someone makes look like a gun or a knife. So this last one could cover things like toys or replica weapons. And so, you have some, cosplayers, or you have, some people who bring, you know, swords or blasters or items that look like real weapons but are not. So that could cover things like that if that is a concern in your library. And again, this is situational. It depends on your patron base. It depends on, what kind of programs you run. If you want to make sure, if you have a cosplay or a D&D session where you encourage people to dress up, you're going to want to have a rule on weapons, on replica weapons. So there's a lot of information here about, weapons and what do you consider a weapon and what does the law consider a weapon. So generally, what is recommended is, kind of look at all of this and say to yourself, again, go back to what is it that I want this policy to do? And then within the law, here are what the law says a dangerous weapon is, so that if all of push comes to shove and we kick somebody out of the library and they come back and sue us for, violation of their constitutional rights or whatever, we have, we're following the same guideline as the law. And we're saying, look, this is what we consider a weapon, just like this is what, the statute considers a weapon. And, that gives you a very strong a defense, right? To show that your policy is legal. So then you look about things like we've been talking about, like toys or replicas or props or cosplay, and in the context of programming, again, if you have programming where these things could be an issue, you're going to want to make sure in the context of your programming, you clarify what is permitted and what isn't. And then you make sure that you enforce it, right? So, you don't want to let, some kids in with fabulous costumes that have really good replicas, and then tell someone else they can't bring their knife in. You want to really, again, you have to make sure it's consistent. I know a lot of Comic-Cons and stuff will do things like zip tie the prop or the replica weapon to the costume so that the person can't pull it out. So, things like that are an option. It doesn't harm the weapon, it doesn't harm the costume, and it prevents the person from pulling the weapon out and brandishing it. And brandishing is another thing we're going to talk about in a minute in relation to guns. So what about 3D printing or other fabrication opportunities, right? You make things out of, clay, and you're always going to have that kid that makes, the knife, or you have a 3D printer. And what about things like ghost guns or knives? We're going to talk about the ghost guns in a minute. Knives you can always restrict because there's no constitutional right to have a knife. So, library can restrict knives. And again, we're going to get into that in just a minute when we talk about guns. So when we talk about knives, knives, in Michigan, if you have a blade of 3 inches or less, it is legal to carry openly. That doesn't mean that the library cannot restrict those. It just means that it's good to know that those are legal, because that is an argument that your patrons will make. And again, this is one of those things that you make a choice, right? Do you say, okay, we're going to go ahead and let knives 3 inches or less, as long as they remain in the person's pocket, right? So you can craft your policy so that the issue isn't whether or not the person has it. The issue is whether or not they pull it out, right? And so, there's pros and cons to that, but that's another consideration. Concealed carry is not permitted with knives. And of course, that brings up the question, how do you know if it's concealed carry? And this is one of those things I probably wouldn't necessarily, put in your policy, but, you could in the event that somebody, pulls a knife out. But even then, if somebody pulls a knife out that was concealed, the fact that it's in their hand means they have it. And that would apply under a just generic policy of you can't have a knife in the library. So I probably would not mention the concealed part because you don't want your staff looking for knives, like staring at people and say, hey, you have a knife on you. I would probably say, probably not put that in your policy. But again, these are decisions that you can make individually with your board and your attorney. Note that your municipality may have an ordinance on knives, and that is something to take a look at. But when you're crafting your policy, because you don't want your policy to be at odds with your municipal ordinances. You want to make sure, again, when we talk about legal policy, that it's in, it complies with both the state and the local law. But because knives are not like guns in terms of constitutionally protected, even though in Michigan, like I said, it's legal to have knives, that doesn't mean you have to permit them. Okay, guns. So, in Michigan, and in many places in the United States as a whole, guns are a very strong part of our culture. And, one of the reasons is that among the many other things that America has contributed to the world in terms of, manufacturing and inventions and, such, a man named John Browning was the man that revolutionized gun making and revolutionized gun design. And he came up with the process for that served as the basis for semi-automatic handguns. So he was one of the first people that figured out how to craft the guns that became the modern gun in terms of how your, say, what we think of as a regular handgun now propels the bullet, out of the gun and how those guns are manufactured. And it was a revolutionary thing that, completely changed everything from warfare to, he even had a hand in, as you can see, he's holding a rifle. So one of his first inventions was, rifle, very, very good in terms of how rifles were done. And his, he actually supplied rifles to the U.S. Army through the Civil War and through subsequent wars until he came up with his handgun, which was very popular in, I believe it was the First World War. But there's this really interesting exhibit at the University of California, Davis, that I highly recommend you take a look at. It's a very interesting kind of mini history on guns, and it's very informative. But that's, this was kind of a spotlight in that. And so, this Americans have been instrumental in in the creation of many guns and the innovations in guns. So, again, it's a very ingrained part of our national culture. And in Michigan, Michigan's always had a very strong, frontiers and backwoods and outdoors culture from when we were pre-statehood. Partially because of how the state was settled, and partially, just how our state is from an ecological standpoint and a geographic standpoint. But that's just the way the fact is, right? So when it comes to firearms, both in the United States and in Michigan, libraries have had kind of a rocky history with guns, particularly in Michigan. And we don't know right now if this is because there was an intent to just completely limit restriction of guns, which is probably a good bet, but also a component of how libraries kind of fell into this hole of why are guns permitted in public libraries, is likely because um, from the research I've done, my personal feeling is that the legislature, libraries just fell into this hole. And so I think 90% of the legislature thinks that guns are prohibited in libraries, and they don't realize that guns are actually permitted in libraries. I think a lot of times libraries are conflated with schools, and other places where guns are not permitted. And so I think maybe a lot of people don't realize that you can bring a gun into a public library, and they would be surprised. A couple of years ago, when there was the hubbub in the Capitol over people bringing guns and stuff to the Capitol around the COVID restrictions and stuff, the Attorney General came out and used public libraries and as an example of a place where employees could feel safe because you can't bring guns in. And immediately, we all contacted her office and we're like, no, you can put guns in the library. So a lot of you are probably aware of the Cattle v. Michigan Open Carry case, which was a case where the Court of Appeals came out and said, look, even though you're a district library and district libraries are very close to municipalities, municipalities can't regulate guns more than the state does. So the state has exclusive purview over regulating guns. And that means that no municipality cannot regulate guns, and no public entity can regulate guns beyond what the state says. So they threw out the ability of libraries to limit guns in libraries. So that means right now, as you're all aware, you cannot prohibit guns from your library to the extent that the law permits them, right? So you can prohibit, illegal carrying, but you want to make sure you understand what illegal carrying is and that your staff understands and can identify it in a legal way, right? Because your staff can't, pull patrons aside and frisk them, right? But if they, see somebody bringing in, like say a full-on machine gun, which is, illegal, or they see a child with what looks like a real gun, or a minor, then at that point, yeah, they can intercede and say you can't have that. But your best bet right now with the weapons policies with libraries is to emphasize the behavior with guns, right? So one of the things you look at is brandishing. So in Michigan, brandishing is using the firearm, or you can also use this for knives. But since you can prohibit knives anyway, you can make a decision in your policy if you're going to, put brandishing in for knives or other things. Brandishing is essentially displaying the firearm in an intimidating or threatening way, or waving it about, wildly. So if you have someone, in your library who's waving the gun about, or, using the gun to point at things, or using it as an intimidation factor, coming in and putting the gun on the service desk and being like, so I want this book, if they're using it in a way designed to, intimidate or threaten, then you can call the police and have them, tell them, no, you can't, that this is not a legal way of using your gun. Another option you can do with gun and weapons policies, again, since you can't prohibit guns in the library for patrons, is when you see somebody with a gun in the library, just call law enforcement. Because even though it's legal, in 9 out of 10 situations, your law enforcement will show up and just walk around the library. They'll just come in and take a look at things, and they may talk to the person and say, hey, we see, you got your AR-15 there. What you doing? And they won't, they know the law, but it can make your staff feel better, make you feel better if, again, you have law enforcement there, just making sure that, the person there isn't looking to, do something to the best of the law enforcement's ability. They're not looking to do anything that is harmful. And so that can be a big deterrent too. So I know there are several libraries that do that. And so that might be a useful thing to put in your procedures as part of a policy. That if a staff member, either views a gun or a specific gun, so you can limit it to, if someone brings a rifle or a shotgun or an AR-15, or has a handgun in their hand, then, we're going to call law enforcement to come in and just let the person do their thing, but then law enforcement can come in and kind of check it out for you. Now, right now, MLA is currently working, I see I forgot to put a T there. MLA is currently working with legislators to add libraries to the list of gun-free zones in Michigan, because right now we have a law that lists, all the places you can't bring guns, things like schools and courthouses. And so there's a movement to put libraries in that list. Now, for years, we've been trying to do this, the MLA committee, and we have had a hard time finding a legislator that would do it for us, because usually when you talk about guns with the legislature, they're like, nope, we don't want any piece of that. But now, recently, there's been several gun reform things passed in the legislature this year that we did find a legislator who is willing to kind of back us up. So we're very hopeful that this is something that we will be able to get passed. And again, the legislature does not, they're very wary of gun control, but this is almost a no-brainer because, as I said, a lot of them thought it was already a thing. So we're very much hopeful that this will happen. So if it does, it would be awesome, but we're very much hopeful that we actually will have a legal state prohibition on bringing guns into the libraries, which would help with this idea of ghost guns. So what's a ghost gun? So a ghost gun is a gun that is sold as a kit very often. It also, plans are sold where you can 3D print the pieces of the kit. So think like a model, if you've ever put together a model of like a spacecraft or a car, where you glue it together and it's the plastic pieces. That's what a ghost gun is, except it's a gun. And you can purchase them via kits where you get the plastic pieces, or you can now get plans that would enable you to print them via 3D printer. Now, there's also in place, so recently there was a Supreme Court decision that came out on this, or it was more like an order, where, so, the federal government had put out regulations that limited, well, it regulated the ghost gun, 3D printer guns or kit guns. And what it did is it said, okay, if you're going to build these guns, they have to be, you still have to license them. So you still have to register them, and they have to have serial numbers imprinted on the parts, which, the reason why they call them ghost guns is because many of these guns do not have serial numbers and they're untraceable. And a lot of the newer ones are actually completely undetectable because every component of them is made with a material that cannot be identified by a metal detector or a gun detector, a firearm, like what you go through at the airport. So at least ones that use like an X-ray or a metal detector. So it's a lot of, so that's been the real fear here, is that there's a whole kind of commerce in these guns that are undetectable, can be used for crime and can't be traced. Now, so the federal government came out with these regulations, and immediately a court in Texas, there was a case instigated, and a court in Texas came out and said, no, these regulations are illegal and we're going to toss them out. So the judge in Texas had an injunction that pending the complete resolution of the case, those federal regulations could not be enforced. And the plans and everything for 3D printing of guns was perfectly fine, and people could 3D print guns in accordance with state laws. So then that went to the Supreme Court. Many attorneys generals from many states, including Michigan, protested, and there ended up being a court case in front of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court just last month came out and said, okay, we do not think these regulations were illegal. We're going to reinstate these regulations again pending the outcome of this case in Texas. So they reversed the judge's injunction and said these regulations are going to stand for now. And so now, again, the federal regulations that say you have to be licensed, you have to register, and the parts have to be printed with serial numbers is still in place. Now, I give you that background so that now we can talk about regulating them in the library. So currently in Michigan, there's no law that prevents the manufacturer of guns, your own gun, right? So to the extent that a ghost gun is a gun that you can put together yourself, in Michigan, there's no law against putting together a gun on your own. However, Michigan does have requirements that say the gun has to be registered, right? And has to be made with certain components that are identifiable by X-ray or metal detector. So you have to have a metal component in the gun. And in prior iterations of a ghost gun, that was usually a metal pin. And so you have to have a metal component in the gun. You can't be completely plastic. So in Michigan, those are the rules. So if you put those together with the current federal rules, they all kind of fit together nicely. It would mean you'd also need a serial number on top of the metal pin or component. Now, so what are libraries supposed to do with this? So in Michigan, you can have guns in libraries. You can manufacture your own gun. So again, you can make this fine line between, okay, the constitutionality of the Second Amendment and the idea of, does the Second Amendment right to a weapon mean you have a Second Amendment right to make your own weapon? Okay, and you don't necessarily, those two don't necessarily go together, which is why, the states are regulating it, right? So, the library can impose some, regulations and some limitations under their ability to regulate in the library because they are a limited public forum. You can do some restricting of 3D printing. So you can say, okay, we're going to restrict our 3D printer and only permit card holders to use it. So people can come in and use the library, but you don't get to use our 3D printer unless you have a card here. You can have them check out the 3D printer so that you know who's using it at what time, right? You can require that adults supervise minors who are using the printer so that, a minor can't just go in there on their own and print them. You can restrict the use of certain materials in the printer. So 3D guns, right? A gun is if you look at, the way a gun works, right? It's kind of a mini explosion in the gun, right? So guns, these 3D printed guns, when they shoot, frequently, not all of them, not some of the newer ones, but frequently they're only good for one use, because if depending on the plastic and depending on the strength of the components you make it out of, it's not strong enough to withstand multiple shots. So the library could investigate, the type of filament, right, or plastic that's required to build a viable 3D printed gun and restrict the use of that material, right? So not permit minors to use it, or you can just not buy it, right? So if you can say, here's the type of filament that's available. And, someone who is really into this and will know what they're building can say, okay, well, I can't build a gun there because it's not gonna, I won't be able to use it. And you can restrict the ability of people to bring their own filament. So there are some things you could do. You can, prohibit, and several libraries have a prohibition on illegal uses, right? So you can't use library facilities for illegal purposes, right? So you can't use the meeting room to sell drugs, right? Or to do something that is illegal. You can't use the computers to, a lot of times if you have a patron use policy, well, you can't use the computers to commit illegal activity. You can't use the 3D printer for illegal activity. You can't photocopy and violate copyright law. Can't use a 3D printer to do illegal action. You can put a sticker on the printer. Now, again, enforcement can become difficult, but again, this is one of those instances where, like copyright, right, you're not necessarily going to hang over the shoulder of everybody who's using the printer. It's more a way to avoid liability for the library, right? So if someone prints a 3D gun and they, harm somebody, the library has policies in place that say, no, you can't do this, and this person violated our policy, right? Now, if the person building the gun is talking to a library employee saying, yeah, look at these great plans I have for building a gun, and the library employee does nothing, that's a whole separate story. But, in conjunction with your attorney, you can craft a good policy for a 3D printer that, or a more general policy in terms of using library assets and using library services and equipment, that you cannot use them for illegal purposes, whether that is copyright violation, whether that's stalking, whether that's child pornography, or whether that's building a gun on a 3D printer. So that is one way that you can, and this is one of the things the ALA actually recommends, is, it's a way to have use have a policy that covers more than one thing, so that you're not having these individual single-use policies. You can prohibit the manufacture of any weapon. So as part of your 3D printing, you can say, part of, if you want to be more specific than illegal purposes, you can say you just cannot print any weapon, period. Right? You cannot print guns, you can't print knives, you can't print, plastic knuckles, you can't print a slingshot, you can't print any weapon, and leave it at that. And then that would be, that would be perfectly fine too. And maybe that would be, easier. Maybe that would just, and then that kind of stays away from singling out guns, which could be a trigger point for, certain patrons who then may try to come and build one just to test your policy. Having a more general policy could kind of put that under the radar. Before I discuss this, I want to mention that when we talk about policies and whether or not, when you have a consideration of what kind of policies you should have, one of the things to look at again is what other policies you have that could cover the new policy you're considering. So again, if you have a policy in your library that could already cover the idea of 3D printed guns, or the idea of limiting limiting the ability of people to cause issues when they bring their guns into the library, or knives. Do you have a policy that says, if you infringe upon the ability of other patrons to use the library, it's going to be a problem? So that way, if you have someone who's bringing in a gun and freaking people out, Or you have somebody who is whether it's a gun or whether if they're building weird things on your 3D printer and people are getting freaked out, then that's a policy you can use as well and say, look, I don't care what you're doing, but you're freaking people out and you're infringing on the ability of other people to use the library, so we're going to have to ask you to stop. And that also is a possibility to deal with some of these more unusual circumstances that might not be easily defined by a weapons policy. And again, that could cover anything from kids and slingshots to spitballs to throwing things, the kind of more nuisance type things as opposed to the more serious things. Now, the one thing we didn't talk about is this idea of, if someone comes in with a gun, how do you tell whether or not they're just coming in with their gun or they're looking to cause serious trouble? And most of the things that I have looked at is that's a very, very difficult judgment call. The problem is that you can't prevent people from coming into the library just because they look like they're going to cause problem. You have to rely on behavior, right? You have to rely on, if they're waving it about, if they're, yelling, or if they're talking about threats, or if they're incoherent, or if they're, then yes, call law enforcement. I would also say, look, if you have a situation that your staff, are really concerned about, when I manage staff in a library, I just said, look, if you're really uncomfortable and you have a really bad feeling, just call the police anyway, right? If it turns out to be nothing, then the worst that will happen is the police will say, hey, don't call us again for that. But it's better to be safe or sorry, right? It's better for, if you have staff that are totally freaked out, it's not something hopefully that they would do every day, but it is something that's also a viable part of a procedure, right? Other than a policy. MLA, myself and Kristen Fonacharo have a session that's going to talk about dealing with difficult situations, dealing with difficult people in the library. And we're going to touch on this topic. We have actually a speaker who has worked with MIOSHA here on workplace violence and difficult patrons and communicating with difficult patrons and difficult conversations. So we're hoping that that will also add some clarification on maybe a metric for figuring out, okay, what's the difference between somebody who really could be a problem and somebody who's just kind of an idiot who's brings their gun to the library. So yeah, one other topic to kind of address in this is the intellectual freedom issue, and this is not something that I think you need to spend a huge amount of time on, but it's something that, given things that are going on right now, and given discussions that we're having within our profession, is definitely worth just mentioning, right? And just maybe ruminating on. So, libraries have long had this history of protecting the ability of people to access uncomfortable and unpopular information, right? And that's a lot of what this book banning is happening, a lot of that, right now, the First Amendment. So, back in the day, there was a hubbub over like the Anarchist Cookbook and the Poisoner's Handbook, and issues of people finding bomb making instructions in chemistry books, and the ability, now with the internet, the ability of people finding, how do I build a pipe bomb on the internet? And widely, librarians have always advocated for, this is information that everybody should be able to have access to. And to what extent are plans to 3D guns part of that, right? So you could have a 3D printer and someone printing gun parts that are not, they don't print them all at once, right? They print them a little bit at a time, and you don't know what they're printing. They're just printing shapes. Unless they pull out, you happen to see them pull out a shape that looks distinctly like a gun, you may not know what they're printing, right? So, how far do you go with this? You could have policy that says you can't use it for this, but does your staff peer into and really, kind of harass people about what they're building? Do you have a form that asks people what they're building and then the library makes a decision whether they can build it or not? Like, again, that's a very slippery slope and something that I would definitely discuss with your attorney. Now, that's a little different than somebody printing all the parts and sitting down in the library and building a gun, right? So you have to kind of make a decision. Again, this is also partially a First Amendment decision. To what extent is the library going to make these tools or information available to everybody for whatever their in use is for, the information they want to know? How much of it is it our business to specifically what they're going to use it for? We have, access to computers that people can use to research, very, very dangerous, what we would think are dangerous points of view, or use it to stalk people, right? Or use it to steal and everything from cheat on their taxes to embezzle. And we don't know they're doing it, right? And again, we can have a policy that says can't use our equipment for illegal purposes, but you're not hanging over the shoulder of your patrons trying to see what they're doing. At least you shouldn't be, right? You can obviously, if you walk by and someone's looking at, child porn, that's, absolutely not okay. And you would call the appropriate authorities, but you wouldn't look at somebody and say, oh, they look like a pedophile, I better look and see what they're looking at. That's not appropriate either. So there is a line here about, what, how do you draw that line about restricting someone's access to certain information? And that's, just something that you talk about in your library, you as a profession. Every situation is different. Every culture and individual libraries are different. You want to be very careful of your patrons' First Amendment rights and talk to your attorney about how those rights extend in relation to what you and your board may look at as safety for your community and your library, and the proper use of your equipment and what that means. And so these are all the kinds of issues that can come up while you're discussing a policy. And so I just wanted to pop that in the back of your mind, since intellectual freedom is such a big issue right now. And so it can become difficult for us on one side to argue that everybody should have access to every information on one topic, and then turn around and say, oh, but no, you can't have access to plans for ghost guns or access to how to build a bomb, if that is indeed still legal in the United States to look at. So again, these are the kinds of things to consider. I'm not saying what's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is an issue that is coming up in this and something to consider and discuss among yourselves and your attorney. So one other thing I want to mention before I get to this in sum is the idea of employment. So when you have your policies, you have your patron policies and your external policies, and then you have your internal policies and your employment policies. In Michigan and federally, when you have employment policies, you can restrict your employees from bringing guns into the library, even though the Court of Appeals case said that people can bring guns into the library. As an employer, you have different authority, right? So you can tell your employees, no, you may not bring guns into the library. You may not bring knives into the library. I don't care if it's on your belt. You can't bring it in. I don't care if it's a penknife. You can have those kinds of rules. Again, you want to look at them holistically, because if you tell an employee they can't have a 3-inch or less penknife, but yet you let them use 8-inch long scissors as part of their job, that could seem a little incongruous to employees. So again, you want to look at this as a big picture and really look at what is your policy intended to do. And make sure that it's treated, again, you treat them equally, right? So it's enforced neutrally and it's enforced equally. So that just because you have an employee that looks a little, he looks a little weird, I don't think that we're a little nervous with him carrying knives. But, Betty over here has her knife in her purse and we don't care about that. You want to be careful about that. So you want to make sure your policies are uniform and consistent, but you absolutely can have policies that restrict weapons for your staff as well. Again, you also want to make sure that you make it clear as to what you consider a weapon for purposes of things like, again, toys, replicas, and that kind of thing. So in some, libraries are not required to have a specific weapons policy. There's nothing in the law that requires it. The implementation of policies depend on your individual library's community, circumstances, your facility, and your staffing, right? If you don't have the staff to enforce a certain policy in an adequate, safe, legal way, then don't have the policy. Because the last thing you want is to be accused of, an equal protection violation where you have staff that are, enforcing policy in an unbalanced way. And the staff member may not be meaning to do it that way, and they may not have the intent for it to be that way. But if you find that, okay, we have a policy on, weapons, but funny, the policy only really seems to be enforced against teenage boys. That could be a big problem. So, you want to be careful about, how your staff enforces the policy and make sure that, they recognize their own biases when they go to enforce, and they make sure that their enforcement and monitoring is equitable. You want to opt for broader multi-purpose policies instead of narrow single-purpose policies. So to the extent that you're able to have, okay, we don't necessarily want to have a weapons policy, but we want to make sure that we have the opportunity if we have a situation arise that we can take care of it. A policy that prohibits illegal activity, a policy that prohibits interference with other people's ability to use the library, a policy that prohibits the creation of a dangerous situation or threatening library staff or other patrons, could be policies that are broader policies that could address a lot of these weapons issues. The important thing is that your staff who's enforcing the policies understand that those policies could apply to this and understand how to apply that policy to these situations. That you want to make sure your policies are very clear and define terms. So again, you have a weapons policy, define weapon, so that there is no question. So, they have a kid who's shooting rubber bands at another kid. Is that a weapon? Probably not. Even though you could take an eye out with that, it's probably not a weapon. But that doesn't mean it's okay. It just means that it would be likely enforced under a different policy. Always consider enforcement procedures. You want to create your enforcement procedures at the same time, for that policy, at the same time that you're creating the policy. You want to make sure you involve the frontline staff who are going to enforce these policies in the creation of the policy. Doesn't mean you have to, give them veto power, but maybe once you have a final draft of the policy before board approval, you run it through your frontline staff so that you could have frontline staff say, oh, wait a minute, this is not going to work, and here's why. And they may have a very good reason for why that you didn't know about. So, I would definitely, run it through your frontline staff first so that, you don't hit those unintended consequences later. Consider talking to law enforcement. If you're very serious about implementing a weapons policy, consider talking about law enforcement and say, what do you consider a dangerous weapon? Like, what do you recommend that we include in this? Again, you don't have to follow everything they say, but that doesn't mean it isn't useful to get their input and add that information, knowledge to what you already have. Always look for unintended consequences. Test a proposed policy. Test it by you could have have your staff look at it. You could have another library director look at it who you know and say, hey, what do you think about this? Have your attorney look at it. I'm happy to look at it, but have if you have it done and you're like, I think this is a really good policy, you could have it as a temporary policy and just have your staff try it out, test it out, and see if it works, or have a kind of an introductory period of the policy where you tell your patrons, look, we're implementing this new policy. We're going through kind of a probationary phase or an introductory phase. So you may notice that, certain things with respect to this topic are going to be a little different, and then get input from your staff. How did this work? Is there something we should tweak? Always get lawyer review on all of your policies. It's not just to make lawyers money. It's to protect you, to protect the liability of the library, and to protect personal liability for you and your staff, and also to increase your safety, right? Your safety and your peace of mind. And any good lawyer is really gonna have some really good ideas and input to help you figure out how you can accomplish what you need to accomplish with this policy and do it in a safe and legal way for your staff. Okay, we are at 11:17. And this here is the link to the survey. I would very much appreciate if you would fill it out for me. I'm gonna stop sharing. And we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. And I very much appreciate you all coming today. It is, like I said, it's gorgeous outside here in Lansing. I hope everybody has a really good weekend. I'll give you a minute to see if anybody has any questions. You can either unmute or you can put them in chat or. Nope, looks like we don't have any questions. Okay. And I hope that everybody has a great weekend. And I look forward to talking with you soon. So thank you very much.